There is a house on the street where Nancy Guthrie lived. Not Nau's house, the one next to it, or close to it. The FBI has not described the exact distance publicly. And that specific silence? In an investigation where federal agents have confirmed blood evidence on the porch, recovered dormant camera footage from Google's backend servers, publicly called this a targeted abduction, and released a detailed suspect description to every major news network in the country. The deliberate refusal to say anything at all about this one specific property is the first detail in this video that you need to sit with. Because the FBI's silence about this property is not neutral, it never is. In an active federal investigation, silence about a specific evidentiary location is a communicative act. It means the answer to the question being asked about that property has not yet been arrived at. Or it means the answer has been arrived at and disclosing it would compromise what investigators are in the process of building. Either way, it is not nothing. Now, before we go any further, here is the contradiction that no other coverage of this case has put in the same frame. To credentialed investigative journalists who have been covering this case from the ground, reported on the same vacant property, and gave directly contradictory accounts of the single most operationally significant detail about it. Brian Entin, NewsNation's senior investigative reporter who has been physically present in Tucson throughout this investigation and confirmed the FBI's renewed attention to the property through law enforcement adjacent sources, stated explicitly on the March 17th episode of Brian Entin Investigates that the neighbor moved out before Nancy disappeared. His exact framing was this: there is one neighbor who moved out before Nancy disappeared, and the FBI has been asking more questions about that situation before the property was empty before February 1st. Dave Mack, investigative reporter for Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, went on air and said the renters moved out immediately after the kidnapping, present until the abduction, and then gone. Immediately after. A third account came from neighbor Lovra, who told Entin on camera that whoever lived there had moved out within a few days of the abduction, reasoning backward from the absence of a vehicle that had stopped appearing before the abduction. Immediately after the abduction, within a few days. Three entirely different accounts of the same timeline from three separate sources, none of them reconciled, none of them corrected by any official body. And the FBI, when asked directly by Newsweek, said nothing about any of it. That contradiction is not a minor reporting discrepancy. It is the difference between a property that was empty during the operational run-up to the crime and a property whose occupants chose to leave in the immediate aftermath of a federal kidnapping investigation in their own neighborhood. Those are two completely different investigative implications, and the FBI has resolved neither one publicly. That is the thread this video is going to follow, and by the time we are done, the FBI's silence on that property is going to feel like the loudest thing in this investigation. Everything in this video comes from named, verified sources: Brian Entin, NewsNation senior investigative reporter; Dave Mack, investigative reporter for Crime Stories; Bob Krieger, retired Pima County SWAT commander, speaking exclusively to Parade; Aldine Meister, a 30-year resident of the Catalina foothills; former FBI agent Steve Moore, former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, and the FBI's own written response to a direct media inquiry about this property. We do not name suspects. We do not accuse individuals. This is an active federal investigation, and every framework discussed here comes from credentialed professionals, not from speculation. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications before we go any further. When this case breaks, you will not want to find out 2 weeks after the fact from a headline. Leave a comment before you keep watching. Here is the question I want you to hold throughout this entire video. If someone needed a reason to be on Nancy Guthrie's street at midnight in a neighborhood where a 30-year resident had seen her, stranger approximately once in 3 decades, what reason would make every neighbor stop looking? To understand why that question carries the investigative weight it does, you have to understand what kind of neighborhood the Catalina foothills actually is. Not in the abstract sense of wealthy zip codes and million-dollar homes, though both of those things are true. The Catalina foothills sits on the lower slopes of the Santa Catalina Mountains north of Tucson. Homes set back significantly from the street, properties large, streets wide, quiet, and mostly empty after dark. No sidewalks in many sections. No commercial establishments putting strangers onto these blocks as a matter of daily routine. No bus routes, no pedestrian traffic that does not belong there. No reason for anyone unfamiliar to be present at any hour, let alone at 2 in the morning. This is a community where residents recognize each other's vehicles on site, where they know which contractor services, which driveway on which day of the week, where they notice when a face does not belong, not because they are hostile or suspicious by nature, but because familiarity is the entire texture of daily life in a neighborhood this enclosed and this consistent. In 30 years of living in the Catalina foothills, Aldine Meister told Brian Entin directly she had seen a stranger on her street approximately once in 30 years. A stranger in the Catalina foothills does not blend. They register immediately, which means whoever planned this abduction and executed it across multiple visits spanning at least 3 weekends before February 1st needed something that a stranger simply does not have, a reason to be there that makes the neighbors stop looking, a cover that is built into the environment rather than constructed over it. A vacant rental property provides exactly that cover. A rental, by definition, introduces transients into an environment that runs entirely on permanence and familiarity. Tenants rotate, faces change. Nobody in a neighborhood of long-term residents can be expected to know every face connected to a property, where the occupants are not permanent. And if someone uses a rental not to live in it in any conventional sense, but to exist in physical proximity to a specific target location without their presence registering as a threat to the surrounding community. The cover that provides is, as the retired SWAT commander from this exact jurisdiction told Parade magazine, close to perfect. Bob Krieger spent his career running high-risk tactical operations in Pima County, the same jurisdiction currently investigating this case, the same mountain backdrop, the same elevated residential streets, the same darkness at 2 in the morning where this crime was planned and executed. He is not someone who found a second career offering television opinions from a distance. He is someone who knows what it physically takes to move through the Catalina foothills at night without generating concern. After Brian Entin broke the story about the FBI's renewed attention to the vacant property, Parade sought Krieger out specifically for an exclusive interview. They did not call a random expert. They went to the person with the most credible local operational knowledge available. And Krieger answered in the operational vocabulary of someone who has spent his life thinking about exactly this category of problem. He told Parade that investigators should look at the vacant property as a possible home base or staging location for the suspect or suspects. Home base, staging location, these are not dramatic words chosen for effect. They are the precise terminology used by people who plan and execute multi-step operations to describe the physical infrastructure those operations require. A staging location is where preparation happens before deployment, where equipment is stored before it is needed, where a person can exist in close proximity to a target without their daily presence generating the kind of concern that would end the operation before it began. He said staying in a nearby rental would give someone a cover story to be at those locations at different times. A cover story is distinct from an alibi. An alibi explains presence after the fact. A cover story justifies it in real time before anything has happened. Someone parked on that street at midnight, sitting in a vehicle outside a home in darkness, has a ready explanation if a neighbor happens to notice them. They are staying next door. That is the end of the conversation. Nobody calls anyone. Nobody thinks twice. And then Craigier said something that no other credentialed expert had said publicly about this case since the doorbell camera footage was released 7 weeks earlier. He told Parade that the property could also be a location to set up surveillance equipment if anyone chose to do so. It could be easily stashed in a structure or on the property without anyone knowing it was there. Stop. Read that again. Surveillance equipment stashed inside a structure without anyone knowing, not binoculars at a window, not periodic visual observation from across the street. A physical installation. A camera or monitoring device capable of observing Nancy Guthrie's home continuously for an extended period from the property directly beside hers, without requiring any human presence at the location at all. A feed accessible remotely, running while the property appeared completely empty to every neighbor who drove past it and to every investigator who canvassed the street in the first weeks of the case. If you found that detail as disturbing as the FBI's silence about this property, subscribe to this channel right now. What Craigier just described is the operational difference between a crime of opportunity and a crime of sustained deliberate intelligence gathering. And this investigation has confirmed this was not a crime of opportunity from the first morning. The geometry of what surveillance from a neighboring property would provide needs to be understood precisely. In the Catalina foothills, properties are large and homes are set back from the road and neighbors are separated by significant distances. From 50 feet of uninterrupted sustained observation over a period of weeks. The following becomes knowable about a home and the person living in it without setting foot on the property. What time the bedroom lights come on each morning and what time they go dark, which entrance gets used most frequently, when the car appears in the driveway and when the driveway sits empty for hours at a time. Whether overnight visitors are a regular feature or whether the occupant is consistently, reliably, predictably alone after dark, which cameras face the street and which ones face the yard and whether the coverage has any gaps worth exploiting, when the garage door opens and how long it stays open before closing again, and crucially, the operational window. The 4-hour gap between a return home at 9:48 in the evening and a doorbell camera going offline at 1:47 in the morning. The window where the neighborhood was silent, no visitors expected, no overnight company documented. A doorbell camera whose position had been studied and factored into the plan. All of that information observable from 50 feet of continuous sustained surveillance using a device that nobody inside the neighborhood or inside the investigation had identified or removed. Now, let us talk about what Aldine Meister saw, because her account connects the vacant property, the January 11th date, and the physical reconnaissance in a way that the coverage has not assembled in one place. Aldine Meister has lived in the Catalina foothills for 30 years. She is not an outside observer. She is a resident of the street where Nancy Guthrie lived, and she knows this neighborhood the way only someone who has been part of it for 3 decades can know it. She told Brian Entin on camera that she saw a man who did not fit in the neighborhood on January 11th, 3 weeks before Nancy was taken. She saw him from a picture window in her bathroom while he was walking on the street in the morning. A hat pulled down low over his face. Street clothing, not the walking or hiking gear that residents of the Catalina foothills wear when they go outside. Hunched over, moving slowly. Not with the purposeful movement of someone exercising. Moving as though he was studying something or confirming something he already had a picture of. When he reached the part of the street near Nancy's home, Aldine told Entin, He took a long look at that house, not a glance, a long, deliberate look. She was alarmed enough to mention it to her husband in the moment. In 30 years of living in that neighborhood, she had seen a stranger on the street once. This man she remembered specifically. She reported what she saw to the FBI January 11th. The same date, the FBI went door to door across the Catalina foothills, specifically requesting camera footage from that exact night. The same date the Guthrie family mentioned in their unified public statement at the explicit instruction of the FBI. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer posted publicly that the family's reference to January 11th points to the suspect conducting what she called a trial run on that date before the night he came back for the last time. She described it as a risky move. She said if he had been seen on the 11th, maybe Nancy would never have been taken. If the man Aldeinmeister saw on January 11th was conducting reconnaissance, and if the property that went vacant nearby was his base of operations during the weeks he was building the operational picture he needed, then the cover story a vacant rental provides is not hypothetical. It is documented by a witness who lives on the same street and who has been saying so since week 1. Aldine flagged the property herself in the first days after Nancy disappeared. She told Brian Entin directly, "The neighbors on the other side of me moved out and I wanted investigators to check that house." She asked the FBI to look at it in week 1. 6 weeks later, in the 7th week of a federal investigation with hundreds of agents and tens of thousands of tips processed, the FBI returned to that neighborhood and began asking the specific question Aldeinmeister had asked them to ask from the beginning. Something connected. Some new piece of information pointed investigators back toward that street and that property after 6 weeks of other priorities. Now, the construction worker thread, because it runs in parallel and it answers the same underlying question from a different direction. Who had a legitimate documented reason to be present on Nancy Guthrie's street during the operational run-up to February 1st, and what were they doing with that access? On the same neighborhood visit where agents were asking about the vacant property, Entin confirmed that FBI agents were also asking residents for the individual names of every contractor and worker active on construction projects in the Catalina foothills in the weeks before the abduction, not company names, not general observations about construction activity, the individual name of every single worker, every person. Entin reported that a resident whose home was under active construction nearby was approached by agents and asked to provide a complete roster of everyone who had worked on the project. The specificity of that request is targeted. It reflects a specific investigative theory about who had a legitimate daily reason to be present on a residential street in this neighborhood for extended consecutive hours without generating any concern. Construction workers have something that a stranger on foot in the Catalina foothills does not have. A work truck at a job site does not raise an eyebrow. A crew eating lunch with a view of neighboring properties does not cause any resident to pick up a phone. A worker on an elevated second-story frame, 3 houses down the street observing which camera housings are mounted at which angles on which fence posts blends completely into the ordinary texture of an active construction neighborhood. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Lance Lysing, analyzing the doorbell camera footage for CBS News, observed something that connects directly to this. He noted that, when the suspect approached the porch, they appeared to expect a surveillance camera mounted above them, but then seemed surprised by the doorbell camera. His conclusion was that the suspect's surveillance of the property, despite being extensive enough to identify the existence of a camera threat, was not complete enough to identify the precise positioning of every device. That gap is consistent with the kind of surveillance you accumulate from a distance rather than the kind you accumulate from inside the property perimeter, the kind of surveillance you would accumulate from a construction frame down the street over several weeks of daily presence. Former FBI agent Steve Moore appeared on Entin's program and addressed precisely what it means when investigators return to a neighborhood in the 7th week of an investigation and begin asking this level of specific targeted questions about both a vacant property and a worker roster. Retracing steps is not going backward, Moore said. It means investigators are moving forward. Something new arrived. A lead, a name, a memory shaken loose by evidence that makes a previously overlooked detail worth cross-referencing against what is already documented and known. That framework applies directly to what happened in week 7. Something arrived that gave the vacant rental and the construction site roster new significance. The FBI went back, and the FBI said nothing publicly about either one. Here is what makes the FBI's silence on the vacant property specifically significant in the context of everything that has now been assembled. In this investigation, the FBI has actively chosen to release doorbell camera footage to social media. They have publicly confirmed blood evidence on the porch. They have acknowledged DNA recovery from the scene. They have described this publicly as a targeted kidnapping. They have shared a detailed suspect description with multiple news organizations. They have confirmed that the suspect purchased a backpack exclusively sold at Walmart. They have not been operating in general public silence. They have been selective. They release what they choose to release, and they say nothing about what they choose not to release. When Newsweek contacted the Phoenix Field office directly and asked about the vacant property, the written response was this: "We typically do not respond or reply to independent reporting. Additionally, as a Department of Justice rule, we do not comment on ongoing investigations." That is not a denial. It is not a clearance. It is not confirmation that the property has been examined and found irrelevant. It is a locked door. And the FBI only locks the doors that lead somewhere worth protecting. Now here is the complete picture that all of these threads assemble when you put them in the same frame. The FBI confirmed this was a targeted abduction. Targeted operations require infrastructure. Infrastructure in the Catalina foothills requires a cover story. A vacant rental property provides a cover story that requires no active maintenance and generates no suspicion in a neighborhood where everyone knows everyone. The retired SWAT commander from the same jurisdiction identified that property as a possible home base, staging location, and site for installed surveillance equipment. Two credentialed journalists gave contradictory accounts of when that property went vacant, with implications that point in completely different investigative directions, and neither account has been publicly resolved. A 30-year resident of the street saw a man who did not fit in the neighborhood on January 11th, reported him to the FBI and flagged the vacant property in week 1. The FBI returned to ask about that property in week 7. FBI agents simultaneously requested the individual names of every construction worker on every nearby job site during the relevant operational window. And the FBI said nothing about the vacant property when asked directly. Every one of those facts comes from a named, verified, credentialed source. Every one of them is individually significant. Together they describe not a single investigative thread, but the intersection of multiple threads that the FBI is following simultaneously, from different directions toward the same central question: who had the cover? Who had the reason to be on Nancy Guthrie's street that made the neighbors stop looking? Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer described this investigation as the polar opposite of a cold case. Red hot behind the scenes, with agents, up to 100 of them, analysts, sheriff's officers, and other law enforcement, all working on actionable leads. The public silence that has characterized this investigation for weeks is not the silence of an investigation that has run out of direction. It is the disciplined protection of something being built toward a specific conclusion. The vacant house is part of what is being built. The construction worker roster is part of what is being built. And Aldine Meister, who flagged the property in week 1 and waited 6 weeks for the FBI to ask the question she had already asked, is part of what is being built. When investigators return to a previously canvassed location with specific targeted questions in the 7th week of a case that has generated tens of thousands of tips and hundreds of active investigators, they are not going backward. They are closing a loop that needed one more piece to close. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The combined reward is over $1 million, anonymous, no identification required. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. If you have any information about this case, about anyone who was renting property in the Catalina foothills in the weeks before February 1st, about any construction worker or contractor who was present on those streets in January, about any vehicle you saw parked somewhere it did not belong, about anyone who seemed to know that neighborhood better than they should have, or about any detail that seemed unremarkable at the time and looks different now from everything you have just heard, please make that call. The information you are carrying may be the piece that crosses a thread investigators have been holding for weeks. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every confirmed development in this case will be covered the moment it enters the public record. When this case breaks, you will not find out from a headline to weeks after the fact. And leave a comment with something specific. Here is what I want to know from you. Brian Entin says the neighbor moved out before Nancy disappeared. Dave Mack says they moved out immediately after. Both are credentialed journalists with sources inside this investigation. Which account do you believe is accurate? And does your answer change what the FBI's silence about that property actually means? Because the answer to that question points into completely different directions. One of them puts someone in that house during the weeks the suspect was building his operational picture of Nancy's home. The other puts someone leaving that house in the days after a federal kidnapping investigation began on their street without a word of explanation. Tell me which one you think it is, and tell me why. Because somewhere in the answer to that question is the thing the FBI already knows and is not yet saying out loud.